Hey guys, what's happening? So now we made our way to Thor issue 24, Legacy issue 750, which also marks Thor's 60-year anniversary. And heading into this, when I initially talked about the different writers who were coming back, like Al Ewing, Jason Aaron, J. Michael Straczynski, and a number of others, I initially thought that this issue was going to feel like a bit of an anthology, with it jumping all over the place and feeling like nothing connected. But then after reading this issue, it was the exact opposite, because everything just connects together so well. But with that said, there's a lot to talk about, so let's just get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so for this one we pick up from the conclusion of God of Hammers, when at the time we had seen Odin sacrifice his life in order for the fullness of his Odin force to become the Thor force, and give Thor the power he needed to defeat the Mangog-infused Mjolnir, otherwise known as the God of Hammers. And at this point, as far as what we'd seen at the conclusion of God of Hammers, when Thor had heard the voice of his father come from the reassembled hammer, this is something that Thor hasn't told anyone, and from what it seems, that's a secret that he's going to be keeping for a while. But it's here where we jump in and we find Thor more or less giving Odin's eulogy, and with how this is described, with the king's reign falling black across Asgard and its weight heavy on the heads of those gathered to send the Stone King home, its roars chilling and its words biting to the bone, with every cry drowned and every tear hidden, the thunder of an orphan and wrathful god dances gently across the stars. A warning for all 10 realms that today is not the day to test the mercy of the morning. And it's like, man, you could almost feel the vibes like through the page, because also as it goes through the different names and titles of Odin that he's either been given or just called throughout the years, whether it be Odin or One Eye, Raven God, the Usurper, the Destroyer, the Giant Killer. But for Thor, the son of Odin, he just lifts his head and he says, "My father is gone." And it's here where we see that a vast amount of people have made their way here to Odin's funeral. From the Celestials to the Watcher, the Avengers, the Guardians of the Galaxy, the Fantastic Four, Cosmic Ghost Rider, Clea, the new Sorcerer Supreme, the Silver Surfer, the Frost Giants, and so many more, as well as Hela, who's taken part in this ceremony, which we'll talk more about in a little bit. But for this large group of people, and even more who are looking from afar, many have come to pay their respects, a number of which have put their differences aside, but there also are others witnessing the ceremony with other intentions, and that's another thing that we'll get to before the end of this. But as we continue with the eulogy being given by Thor, he talks about how his father was a troubled man, a vicious god, a complicated husband, and how even in death, Odin's shadow still falls over himself and Loki. And Thor admits that for some reason, even with his father dead, he's still terrified of him. And you can tell that even through the course of this, Thor is shaken to his core because the loss of his father hurting him so deeply. And it's here where Thor mentions that even though Odin was his king with a crown of blood and feared by all with mercy for no one, but even still he had taken in and raised his greatest enemy's abandoned child, which in that case refers to Loki. And when Thor mentions that Odin had granted power to those who he had deemed as equal, even though they were not Asgardian, because he judged them by the worthiness of their hearts, to where then in that case he's referring to Beta Ray Bill. And Thor admits that these are traits that are seldomly found in himself. But over the years, though Odin has casted Thor out of Asgard a number of times, he admits that every time that he came back as a better man, a better god, so that over the course of time, he would be a better king to the people of Asgard. And it's here where Thor then opens the Book of Kings, otherwise known as the Tome of Kings, which we had talked about briefly not too long ago when we were getting into God of Hammers. But just as a quick refresher, the Tome of Kings, or the Book of Kings, is a book that dates back to Thor's great-grandfather Buri, which was then passed down to his son Thor and to his son Odin, and recently to Thor. But aside from them, no one else can read from this book, because its pages can only be read by the king of Asgard. And as far as what's written in this book, it's a number of stories and prophecies with information about the past and the future that have been recorded by the previous kings of Asgard. And what we end up finding here throughout the course of this issue is that from here, Thor goes into the Book of Kings and he shares a few of these stories in honor of his father, so that for Odin, when he passes to Valhalla and becomes the myth, the legend, he'll become the thing that he's always made real. And it's here where we get into these different stories, with this first one that was written by Walt Simonson. And with the way that this is done, like a lot of these stories, they seem random, but really for each of these, they tie right into the things that Thor was saying. Like for example, for the first story, which seems to be just another telling of the origin of Beta Ray Bill, with him being one of the 10 champions chosen from the Great Corbinite Games, to where out of those 10 champions, 7 died in the Coalescence Chamber, which then had left him down to 3. And out of those 3, Beta Ray Bill was the only one who had survived again, and had also been proved to be compatible to be genetically merged with his Turok, which is like the most vicious beast of the Corbinites. And with the priest regaining control of their alpha, they sent him to destroy the beta, but as it turned out, the beta was way more capable than the alpha, which it then led to Beta Ray Bill killing the alpha rather than him being killed and just disposed of. But with doing this, Beta Ray, he didn't stop there, because after slamming the alpha's head into the ground, he had then went after the priest, Lord Octuk, who had wanted the confirmed death of the beta to also be a sacrificial offer to the gods so that the Corbinites would have a safe voyage. So essentially, Beta Ray Bill was just like, say less, the people need a sacrifice, done. And Beta Ray Bill dunked his head too, killing the guy. And it's one of those things to where with Thor telling this story, which from here leads to Beta Ray boarding Scuttlebutt and telling the ship he's its new partner rather than commander, and then going into stasis to where, like we know, he'd eventually run into Thor. But with Thor telling this story just after talking about Beta Ray Bill, who was this guy who Odin saw as worthy, who Odin had taken in as another Asgardian, and it just shows everyone, in spite of Beta Ray's past, to where if you ask me, Beta Ray Bill didn't do nothing wrong. But I could also see how some would think that he did. But in a way, with Thor sharing this story, it's a way of him telling the people more of what he meant with saying that Odin judged people from the worthiness of their heart. But then after this, the next story that Thor reads, it takes us back to the time of Thor Volume 2, issues 24 and 25, when at this time, for him to defeat Mangog and Thanos, he had to equip himself with the Belt of Power, the Shield of Life, and the Gauntlet of Tomorrows, which was a battle that also left the Recorder fatally injured. But with this picking up from the end of issue 25, we see Odin reach out to Thor from Asgard, telling Thor that now the battle is over, he needs to remove all this armor. Though they make him nigh invincible, they're seductive in nature, and if Thor was to continue to wear them, they would drain his noble and righteous character, leaving him without empathy or moral. And initially, this had caused Thor to believe at the time that Odin was thinking that Thor was possibly more powerful than him, and at first Thor refused to take off the armor. But right after Thor refused, the Mangog shows up again, to where from there, they then fight for 2 hours straight, which is a really long fight if you ask me. And I know Thor's had longer, but still, 2 hours? But through the course of this, what this did, it showed that Thor was succumbing to the corruptions of the belt, the shield, and the gauntlet. But for Thor, before he could lay his final blow on the Mangog, Odin quickly lifted his enchantment to only then reveal to Thor that this wasn't the Mangog who had returned, but instead it was his brother Balder, who Odin had cloaked to appear to be the Mangog in order to show Thor how bad his corruption was getting, before it was too late and the effects were irreversible. And with Thor realizing this, he took off the Belt of Power, the Shield of Life, and the Gauntlet of Tomorrows. And then from here, Odin had then restored the Recorder, who had just been laying there waiting for a revive this whole time. But again, this is one of those instances where this story for Thor, with him sharing this from the Book of Kings, this tells the people about a time where Odin had saved Thor from himself. But then after this, Thor goes to the next story, which in this case comes from J. Michael Straczynski. And it's here where we go to a time when Thor had Volstagg bring him an attorney whose services were retained by Donald Blake for the purpose of making a will that would be accepted by the people of Asgard and the people of Midgard. And for a moment, this attorney is like, well, I thought you guys were immortal. And Thor is more or less like, well, we are until we aren't. And even though him, his father, and Loki, they've had their number of deaths, but Thor lets this guy know that sooner or later there comes a time when that touch lingers and darkness does not depart, and then they are no more. But then this attorney's like, well, you know, you could have a Thor corporation that would just control your assets after your passing. But with him saying this, he then looks at the face of Thor and he's just like, what was I thinking? But then from here, Thor gives him a list of his personal bequests, which start with the instructions that Balder, his brother, should take power after he's gone. But then from here, he continues with a message to the people of Midgard, where Thor goes on to say that he's walked among the people of Midgard for centuries, and how he's observed the beauty that humanity has often failed to observe in itself, as well as the terror and mindless murder that is done to build empires that years later people will just forget. And over time, he's also witnessed the great feats that mankind has accomplished, from aviation to space travel. But over the centuries, men have always revered the gods because they're immortal. And it's here where Thor talks about, for the gods, because they're immortal, they're resistant to change, because for them there's really no urgency, and for the gods it seems like they have an eternity to just think about changing, which is why for them in many cases they don't. But in the case of humans, because their lives are brief, they must grow, they must learn, they must change, they must do and think and become in the now. And Thor goes on to say, like when a tree sees another tree, it sees something unchanging like itself. But from a tree's perspective, humanity, it's more like a blur. A beautiful, magnificent, impossible blur. And Thor goes on to state that he wants humanity to know that it's not humanity who should be worshipping the gods, but instead the gods who should be worshipping humanity. But then it's from here where Thor makes the request of what he would have done with his body. To where in his case, he wants his body sent to the storms of Saturn, because there are bolts of lightning 10,000 times stronger than the ones on Earth. And the attorney assumes that Thor is saying this because Thor is possibly hoping that these bolts of lightning will bring him back to life, but Thor lets him know that that's not the case, because he's drawn to the sound of thunder, because it's the only song that he knows. But with doing this, Thor could share stories with this thunder that could shatter worlds, and they would just simply keep each other company until the end of all things. But after this, Thor has Volstagg escort the attorney out, as well as see to the guy's payment. And when the attorney asks on his way out, like, what if the people don't believe, what if they don't understand? And Thor just lets him know that they will, eventually, given what's coming. And from here, with the next story that we see, this one's written by Al Ewing, and it picks up from Al Ewing's Loki, Agent of Asgard, which tied into Secret Wars and showed us Loki moments after the multiverse ended. But at the conclusion of Loki, Agent of Asgard, we were left more or less with this huge cliffhanger of Loki writing next and just walking through this door. And it's right here with this next story that Al Ewing picks up right from there, where Loki arrives 14 billion years ago during the Sixth Infinity, arriving right in front of Sciencer Supreme, Talia, and I feel like every time I try to say her name, I'm saying Talia, but it's Ta, like the planet Ta, because this is Galactus's mother. And it's kind of crazy at this point, because when Loki gets here, she's like, nah, this guy's no servant of the Black Winter. And when she says that, it's kind of like, I don't think she knows where that's going, because at this point for them, that's a threat level they need to turn up a few notches. But for Loki, from here, he goes to check on Verity Willis, who he thought had stepped through that door with him. So from there, he checks on her to make sure she's okay. But then after finding her, and more or less realizing that everything else just continued after Secret Wars, he then goes from here and he makes his way to Asgard, only to then arrive at this current time at Odin's funeral. And it's pretty nuts with how this is done, and seeing Loki come around full circle after Secret Wars and make his way here in this moment. And not only to see his reaction to seeing that Odin is dead, but then also to watch the way that he processes this. Because at first he's like, I'm sorry, Father, that I wasn't here when you needed me. And then he looks up and he sees himself and he's like, wait, that's me. And when he sees himself there, he just goes off like, I was here. How did I let this happen? And when he sees himself, he asks, was it you? And not so much as the metaphorical hand holding the sword, but rather the hand behind the hand. And with this Loki here, that's more or less a ghost of the past. He can't be seen or heard by anyone else here, and it's unclear if current day King Loki can hear himself because he doesn't respond to him at any time. But past Loki, he's just going off. He's calling himself an idiot for even coming here because he can't do anything about what's already happened. And at this point, he's like, they might as well just burn me on the pyre. But then he asks current day Loki to take the mask off, to give him something, crack a smile, give him some kind of confirmation, and for him to show past Loki who this Loki truly is. And it's right there where current day Loki just breaks down crying and takes off. And again, it's not fully clear if he can hear the past Loki at all, or if this is just current day King Loki breaking down, because also in this moment, Thor's reading from the book Words from Odin, which read, my child, who is both son and daughter, I know you, I know everything that you are, and I love you still. And I could imagine either case, or even both cases, bringing this reaction out of Loki. Because however you choose to look at it, for Loki, the mask comes off, he breaks down crying and he goes off to be alone. And it's here where past Loki, now appearing as the daughter, quote unquote, she follows after him, she sits beside him, and she apologizes, saying that you'd think I'd know better, of all people. And she lets him know that it's the fear talking, because she's afraid for King Loki and the chance of him going backwards with his future being much like her past. But also towards the conclusion of Loki, Agent of Asgard, past Loki had made sure that that wasn't the case. And it's here where she tells King Loki, I'm the past now, you're what comes next, and you can take the story anywhere. And it's from here where she returns back to the Sixth Infinity, or the Sixth Cosmos, more or less telling King Loki like, alright, one last adventure. And it's from here where Loki then piggybacks off a signal from Talia which goes to the reality after hers, the 8th cosmos, to where then she creates the next door, which will take her directly to Doctor Strange, to where then that story will continue in Defenders Beyond issue 1, which I believe releases this summer 2022. And after this, for the next story, we go to one that is written by Jason Aaron that takes place on Midgard 1 million years ago. But for this one, to where it's titled Who Wields Who, it's told from the perspective of Mjolnir, who at this point is not only refusing to let Odin hold the hammer or lift the hammer in front of a bunch of mountain giants who are just more or less like, okay, we'll wait. But through the course of this, Mjolnir thinks back on its own memories of being the god Tempest and how it used to roar through all of creation with bellowing thunder and howling hurricanes, a storm the size of a galaxy, and how at one point it was recognized as the god Tempest, the mother of storms, the first winds to stir the dust of creation. But all of that was before it met Odin, the warrior god, who had trapped the god Tempest in Uru and tamed it in this hammer, or so he would like to think. And it's pretty crazy how here, even 1 million years ago, with Odin believing that he's tamed the god Tempest, forged it into Mjolnir, and he's using it to protect the prehistoric people of Midgard. But we're shown here that even at that time, Mjolnir expresses that there are times when they're soaring between the realms and the walls of time, they're rent thin, which even back then allowed Mjolnir to see echoes of others who would wield the hammer in the future, who at this time are legends yet to even be born. And in this future, we see Thor, we see Beta Ray Bill, we see Jane Foster, and Mjolnir talks about these wielders, saying they range from gods who will someday wage battle beyond compare against the fiercest of cosmic foes, and who will struggle above all else to be worthy of me. And this introduces the idea of Mjolnir knowing 1 million years ago that the enchantment that deemed someone to be worthy, this really gave Mjolnir the power, rather than Mjolnir just being some hammer or some tool, or even the god Tempest who had actually been tamed. Because in the days where it was just the god Tempest, it predated Odin. It watched over the gods in their infancy, and again, the god Tempest was there at the first winds of creation. And it's here with Mjolnir saying how it humbles these gods that were given this example with Odin, where he confronts the king of the mountain giants and he tells him to yield, but then Mjolnir just flies right through this guy and takes the kill, and with doing so, showing Odin something that he really didn't understand at the time. Because with Mjolnir getting glimpses into the future, seeing the enchantment and seeing future wielders that are to come, this caused Mjolnir to know a long time ago it was the hammer that wielded them, the user, and not the other way around. And we're shown this with this moment to where Mjolnir has pretty much humbled Odin to the point of where he's like, you know what, let's just go home. Just take us home, Mjolnir. And I like that Jason Aaron has given us that addition to the Odin that we've seen from that time in his life, but from the perspective of Mjolnir. But then at this point for Thor, he's finished with his reading from the Book of Kings. And when Thor closes the book, he kind of stands there silent for a moment until Loki comes back, and he's more or less like, Thor, we gotta, do the next part of the ceremony. And it's from here where Thor calls for the arrow, and when Volstagg brings it to him, we find that it was crafted from Gungnir, Odin's spear, and it's brought to Thor along with the longbow made from a branch of Yggdrasil, with it being carved by Hawkeye himself, who had made sure that the flight would be strong and true, and the string of the bow was woven from the black hair of Hela, the goddess of death, with finally the arrow's head made in the eternal flame of Muspelheim and affixed to the spear with the sap of the world tree. But then it's here where we get to the end of the ceremony, where they send Odin's body adrift, which I believe in this case is just his armor and what remains of his spear, since Angela had already mentioned in the previous issue that there's nothing actually left of his body. But then it's here in this moment where Thor, he approaches Sif and he asks her, like, what does she see? And she tells Thor she sees everyone looking back right now, and it's kind of unnerving. And initially Thor is like, well, yeah, it's an Asgardian pyre, of course everyone's watching. But Sif lets him know that they're not looking at Odin, but they're looking at Thor. And though Thor can't see it for himself, Sif lets him know that currently he's being targeted by over 3 million different warships, battle planets, and dwarf jump stations, which just ensues a number of threats or even battles that Thor will have to face soon. But even with that being the case, we're reminded that Thor knows something that everyone else doesn't, as far as Odin's soul currently being trapped inside of Mjolnir, which at this current time Thor doesn't know why. He's not sure if this is some type of test from Odin or what exactly it means, but we'll get to that shortly. But before Thor can light the pyre, he finds that he just can't do it, and he asks Loki to take the shot instead. And of course for Loki, he's like, I don't know if that's what Odin would have wanted. But with the way that this plays out and you have Loki taking the shot instead of Thor, it really turns out to be a perfect turn of events. Because when Loki takes this shot, and initially when Loki takes a shot, he's kind of like, well, Thor didn't want to take it because it's too far, and the best marksman couldn't hope to make this. But when Loki takes the shot, he hits the pyre spot on, which I would probably credit towards Hawkeye for setting this whole thing up and making it dummy proof, because I assume somewhere Hawkeye's watching after making this bow, and he's like, I ain't gonna have these guys make me look bad. So he made sure that this long bow was like easy to use. But with Loki taking the shot and Odin's pyre igniting within the Asgardian sky, he looks at it and Loki kind of cracks a joke of, second sun. And not only with it looking like a second sun, like S-U-N, but also with Odin being the second son of Asgard. And then on top of that, now with the shot being taken by Loki, who was more or less a second son with an asterisk. And it really just makes this turn of events and how this played out like the perfect moment, rather than if the shot was just taken by Thor, Odin's firstborn. But then it's from here where the ceremony then goes into more of the celebration. And it's from this moment where we then follow Thor further into the evening, to where at this point he's kind of winding down after the ceremony and everything. And at this point he hears the hammers say, "I thought I taught you how to shoot." And from there, Odin's just like, you had your little brother do the deed. Like, how are you expecting to run Asgard if you can't even do this? And while Odin's talking, Thor just keeps saying no, like he's not doing this right now. But Odin goes on saying how he's sorry he couldn't attend because he couldn't bear to see Thor's mother, which in a way feels like it's referring to Odin's last words before he gave up the Odin Force, when he told Thor why he held on to it. And Odin mentioned how he wanted Thor's mother to see him then. But with Odin going on and telling Thor, raise your voice at me one more time, and we're gonna see who wields, and right there Thor just picks up the hammer and just throws Mjolnir into the mirror. But it's here with Thor questioning Odin and asking him, like, why is it only that Thor can hear Odin? Why is Odin laid hidden in this hammer? And why will Odin not move on and go to Valhalla like he should have after his death and what everybody assumed at the ceremony? And it's here where Odin tells Thor that he can't go to Valhalla. And on Odin's part, it's not for a lack of trying, because after Odin died, when his spirit passed, he walked to the gates of Valhalla, hoping to find his brothers and his father, only to arrive there and find the gate broken and the great halls empty. And this is why Odin came back, because he has nowhere else to go. And as it stands right now, Valhalla is gone, and Odin needs Thor's help to make this right, which from here seems to be something that we'll pick up with throughout the course of Banner of War. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below so you can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.